Ukraine's EuroMaidan revolution wasn't only held on the capital's Independence Square. Kyiv activists first gathered in the center of their city on November 19th, holding flags of the European Union and anti-Russian banners. It was as if they predicted that the signing of the association agreement with the EU would be disrupted. I remember one banner which said, "We're going to Europe. The Kremlin can get lost." At the time, everyone viewed it as politically incorrect. No one could predict how this all would end.
We were fighting for our rights, for being included in Europe. There was a feeling of something festive, a feeling of freedom.
The spontaneous demonstration in Kyiv was attended by less than 100 people. After Yanukovych's rejection of the association agreement, the number of protesters reached 1,000. On November 22nd, people in dozens of Ukrainian cities were demanding the association agreement be signed. I wrote and said that I'm going and asked if anybody else wanted to. Someone said, "Let's wait, maybe the protests in Kyiv will wind down." But I viewed it like this. I don't like this, and I'm going to express my opinion. On the first night of the protests in Donetsk, there were only 5 people. On the next day, around 100, and later that same day, twice as many. The regional government tried to crack down on the demonstrations. It organized anti-European campaigns and provoked clashes. They tried to clear the protesters with excuses. Utility workers came in a new car and said that they needed to wash the Taras Shevchenko monument. I had never seen them wash it before. I told them that we could do it ourselves. On November 23, 2013, Cherkasy became the first city where police cracked down on peaceful protesters. Around a dozen activists were detained. Later, confrontation between the government and protesters became especially severe in southeastern Ukraine. However, despite threats and attacks by pro-Russian activists, people continued to hold meetings, follow news from Kyiv, and collect aid for the protesters in the capital.
A minibus pulled up and 30 people with metal rods jumped out of it. 30 more people came from the other side, and they just started beating protesters up. If this happened in 2014, I would have been killed for participating in the protests.
Maria was held captive by pro-Russian militants for over a year. She says that protesters in Luhansk were passive and that the demonstrations were mostly quiet and small. The most active supporters of Euro integration went to the Independence Square in Kyiv, and in Luhansk, situated only a dozen kilometers away from Russia, views of the events were being shaped by propaganda.
They tried to control people with local TV, saying that the protesters were crazy.
The first EuroMaidan protest in Crimea took place on November 24th. Around 200 people gathered on the central square of Simferopol. It was already filled by numerous supporters of the not-yet-ousted President Yanukovych's Party of Regions. The supporters were holding Russian flags. Pro-European activists walked through the central streets of the city, where several hundred more people joined them. We didn't want people to say that Crimeans did not participate in EuroMaidan. That was Russian propaganda. It was more important for us to dispel it, to show that there were protests in Crimea. Public opinion in Crimea was shaped by an organization called Stop Maidan. They held campaigns, car rallies, and protests in support of the Eurasian Customs Union and Russian ideology. They were generously financed and attended by thousands of people. Of course, it was very difficult for us in Crimea due to the forces that opposed us. It was impossible to change the situation in a public way. EuroMaidan activists were forced to leave the occupied cities, but they are dreaming of the liberation of their native land and the victory of European values.